Yes. Okay. I'm Mike Elledge. I'm the Associate Director of Usability, Accessibility Research and Consulting, which used to be known as Usability and Accessibility Center. But because of all the changes and definitions for things like centers and institutes, we changed our name, which was easier to do than to report into the Board of Trustees. So we're now UARC. I was looking over the agenda for today's WebDev Cafe and sent a note to Bert and said, Bert, is anybody going to be talking about CMS accessibility? He said, well, not explicitly. How about you? So I said, oh, okay. I've been wanting to find out a bit about this to begin with, so I'll find out what I can find out in the next couple of days, and we'll at least get started on it. So this is going to be really less about which CMSs are most accessible and which ones people should use for that reason than what Mike Elledge found out in a few hours trying to put something together that would be useful. So for those of you who don't know about what Usability, Accessibility Research and Consulting does, I want to do a little bit of plug. We do usability testing, evaluation of websites and software for how accessible they are for persons with disabilities. And we'll either do formal testing with people sitting at a computer doing tasks, or based upon some heuristics we have, or rules of thumb, we'll give you feedback on how well it looks as though your website is going to work. So we have discounted rates for groups within the university. We also have outside clients who pay a market rate. So if at some point you want to find out how well your site's going to work, please contact us. We have good rates, and we can give you some useful feedback. So let's see. Okay, there we go. So as I was looking at this, I thought, I really ought to do a couple of definitions, because content management systems seem to really run the gamut from things being simple to being really complex, and they even seem to sort of bleed into learning management systems. So it's a really broad spectrum of things. So when I was looking at it, I said that defining a content management system is going to be an application that enables users to update information essentially without worrying about formatting, but also by maintaining website integrity. So in the sense of doing really complex web development, not really thinking that in those terms. I'm thinking more in terms of the user wanting to put information into a website and maintain some integrity to it. So more in the sense of what msu.edu is doing with their system with Cascade. What are the benefits? You've seen a lot of the benefits. Essentially saving time on maintenance for the people running it without having to put a lot of oversight into place for persons uploading content. That seemed to be most significant. In terms of accessibility, it's a pretty basic definition of accessibility. It's people with or without a disability being able to do things on the content management system that somebody with a disability, without a disability, can also do. So what does that mean in terms of content management system? Well, typically when a content management system is thought of as being accessible or not, they'll say, okay, you go onto our WYSIWYG, you enter information, it comes up and it's valid HTML code. And you can also, by the way, add headings to it. You can add alt tags. So what you produce is going to be valid code. In fact, there's a couple of different aspects that are important when we think about applications being used at MSU to fall within the larger category of is this going to be something that fits the requirements of the web accessibility requirements on campus. And that is, for something to be truly accessible, software has to be able to be set up and configured by somebody with a disability, for instance, somebody who can't see it. And secondly, has to be able to update content within the application. Not only does the content have to be rendered in a valid way. But the process of putting that or managing that content has to be accessible as well. As you can imagine, finding information to encompass all three areas is kind of difficult. So in looking out what's out there, I found some information. I also found out that there's not a whole lot out there in the way of analysis with respect to accessibility and content management systems. It's clearly a hot topic in higher ed. I think everybody within the CIC is debating what content management systems they might use, particularly from an accessibility standpoint. As a result, I got lots of good feedback from my peers who are in the CIC IT group that relates to accessibility and usability. As one of the speakers mentioned earlier, there's a huge number of configurations. One of my peers said there's 700. I didn't bother checking everything on that website that Bert gave us a link to, so I'm just assuming that Michael is correct when he said that there's 1,000 of them in that list. I wouldn't disagree with that. So there's a lot of different alternatives out there. A nice study that was done by, although it was a small one, by .edu Guru looked at which were the primary CMSs used by universities. They sent out, I assume, to about 4,000 different schools a questionnaire, got about 144 returns. And the ones that turned out were that Omni Update had about 13% of the share, custom configurations about 9%, Cascade 8%, .cms 8%, Drupal 8%. The largest percentage was for other. So that means that a lot of those little ones are used and not in these keys. Secondarily, people would typically use WordPress, Joomla, or Drupal as a second form of CMSs. Multiple use of them, campuses, depending upon which department and which familiarity people have, I assume. Most of them do claim to some degree of accessibility, and if your user is careful, they can produce accessible and valid markup, putting information into the WYSIWYG editor. But typically they don't help or encourage authors to produce or maintain accessible content, and they're not accessible themselves. Now, in order to have accessibility within a CMS application, there's some key things. First of all is that if you're a vendor, you have to have, as a company, a requirement or a priority for accessibility, such as what Cascade has done. At least they've spoken about that being important on their site. For an open source type situation, you need to have contributors within the developer community who are interested in producing accessible modules for people to be able to contribute information or edit content. Drupal is a company that, or is an open source provider who has made it a priority. That seemed to be the one that came up most often for that. You have to have accessible components, templates, and themes that are by nature have accessible code, modules or modularity within the system so that when people use different functionality, yes, it's based upon accessible HTML and uses CSS for presentation. It's also essential to have compliance, especially if you're an open source provider, across the different modules that you're providing to people, because there's nothing more disconcerting for somebody who can't see a site to go in and find that the structure of each page is different. So that's really important. Ultimately, accessibility falls under the A tag requirements that are put out by the W3C. I haven't run across anybody who has said that we're A tag compliant. They typically say, oh yes, you can produce code that is accessibility level 2 or 1 with WCAG 1.0, which has since been superseded by 2.0 anyway, but at least that's something. Things that are helpful, and in fact these are things that have been built into Drupal that allow you to make things more accessible on a page for somebody, choosing particular font sizing, and these are more or less items that you would choose on a page, different page styles and how things are represented, foreground and background, ensuring that when somebody is putting some information onto a page that it asks for a page title, a document filter that would take a look at the code that has been uploaded if you're cutting and pasting something to make sure that it's compliant, validating the page for proper HTML code, having some kind of accessibility analysis tool which would take a look at what's on the page and let you know if it's accessible or not. It helps to have accessible text editors too. TinyMCE came up the most often. That was something that was considered in the Sakai project, and ultimately they decided to update from FCK editor to CK editor because they didn't want to have any difficulty with people migrating from one version of Sakai to the other. But apparently CK editor is a much more accessible text editor than FCK was, which I always thought was a great acronym for a very inaccessible text editor. So, ultimately what you would really like to have, you'd like to have a text editor that's going to promote accessible page content in the way of saying that when you're creating a page, perhaps for a particular type of page, a space for where you're going to put your heading, some space if you were going to put items within a list, sort of to walk you through the different content pieces so when it comes out it's got the accessibility hooks that are helpful. Ultimately, the other thing you're going to need, though, if you don't have something that's so fine as that, is an understanding on the part of the person putting in the content what sort of standards are important to make it accessible. Include headings, include phrases for links that make sense out of context, making sure that that you have lists for items that are similar. The same sort of things you have to think about when you're designing a website. Of course, the challenge there is one of the reasons for having content management systems is that people don't really want to have to know how to use HTML. So there's kind of the rub. So here's some accessibility claims among some of the items that were covered today and some of the other ones that came up as I was searching through. Joomla, PageLime, and Cushy CMS weren't on the list, and this is from the CMS Matrix link page that Bert gave us. Cascade claims to be Web Accessibility Initiative compliant. .cms says yes, but it'll cost you more. Drupal says yes, it's limited. Joomla says no. Omni Update says yes, and Plone says yes, and WordPress says it's limited. Now, there's not a lot of detail on that. However, there is another study I came across that went into a bit more detail about this. So what are the benefits to a CMS application? You basically know what they are. In terms of facilitating accessible content authoring, that's really the part that is going to be most interested to us and ultimately to the university in terms of compliance with our web accessibility requirements. So another review of different CMSs in terms of satisfaction levels. On a scale from 1 to 10, the average was 7. Omni Update, 9.2. And Cascade, those are the two main, along I guess with Ectron, the two main vendor-based CMSs. In other words, that cost money. Omni Update, 9.2. Cascade, 7.1. Ectron 6.3, but also open source ones are up there. Reason, .cms, Drupal. So there's some good choices there whether you're talking about open source or third-party type CMSs. Now the best review I came across was done by CFIT, and this was actually setting out particular tasks that were done by somebody using using JAWS, a screen reader, and seeing how well the different CMSs worked. And some of the common issues that came up were that there weren't any structural headings that were within the application, that in fact there was poor markup within the application, edit boxes wouldn't be properly labeled, there wouldn't be titles on pages. There's difficult navigation, for instance, in some of the functionality, like in the blogs, and blogs are just difficult to do, as well as discussion boards in terms of accessibility anyway. Links that were inactive within the applications, inadequate or missing labels before form fields, a lack of consistency between modules, confusing labels or technical speak, something called a smart folder. You go in, you can't see what it is. What is a smart folder? Reload the tree from the server. What is that? I don't know what that is. Use of frames, especially if you don't have markup, and content structure not being maintained in a text editor if you upload it. These are typical problems you would find within a website, but this is within the applications themselves. The things that you would look for within an application to be accessible would be having checkboxes that were well labeled and read correctly, login boxes that were correctly, list boxes, combo list boxes, edit boxes, read correctly, again by a screen reader. Skip to content, skip navigation links, good headings and page structure, no frames, well marked up form elements. Again, all the things that you look for in quality HTML pages, pages. So the CMSs that were found to be best performing from an accessibility standpoint were one called Quick and Easy. It's a very simple interface. It was easy to get around, not a particularly complex CMS. Plone was considered to be good also. It was customizable and also extendable. Drupal, simple, uncluttered, and clean. The comment there was one of the best, and they would recommend it with some customization to the version they tested, which had a few bugs. And then Joomla, again, if some problems were addressed, it would be recommended. So as we're looking at the different ones that are out there, those are 4 that were considered to be good ones. Here's some other comments of people sending into to the responding to this. A tutor, which was developed by the Adaptive Technology Resource Center at the University of Toronto, was not included. And I know the folks there, and I would guess, without having actually dug into it and tried to use it, that it's probably the most accessible out there. It's really more of a learning management system. The idea is that you develop course curriculums using it as well as content, but these things are so blurry, you could call it a content management system too as well, I suppose. WordPress, simple CMS for less complex websites. CMS Made Simple, CPS. So there's some other alternatives out there too. Some of the CIC comments we had on CMSs, one of my peers is using Silverstripe. Has anybody heard of Silverstripe? Okay, a couple. He thinks it's great. Now, he also does programming and development. So he thinks that's a lot better than what they currently have, which is pretty crappy. He wouldn't tell me what that was. It might have been one they developed. Drupal 7 is making a strong commitment to accessibility, or so says a Drupal 7 proponent who works at St. Edward's University. They have a group of people that's dedicated, a listserv that's dedicated to accessibility issues and resolving them within Drupal, which is a good sign. The developers who are developing new modules are also signing pledges that have to do with making accessible modules for Drupal, which is another one too. And then Plone is the first CMS compliant with Section 508. So this is what the CIC, Big Ten School, accessibility people have recommended. So this is a list of where I got the various pieces of information. I would have to get permission to share some of this. For instance, there's a CMS analysis that came out of Penn State, which takes a first cut at whether things are accessible or not. There's also a presentation by Cruzet Rueas who was talking about what was going to be happening in the next version of Drupal 7 accessibility-wise. But if you are interested in those, I can find out, and I'm sure that, so long as you give credit, if you use the information in another presentation, they'd be happy to share it with you. So I think what this shows is that there is an opportunity out there for all of you who have extra time and a desire to spend it finding out what's accessible and not accessible, to do a really comprehensive look at CMS systems to ensure that they are accessible before you implement them. Do we have any questions?